Nitika Bagaria, Dionysios Pelekis, Francesco Bonfiglio. Very warm welcome to Digital Markets Research Hub. Today we'll be discussing a topic which resonates with many, and yet not many understand the technicalities of things. So I wanted to combine both the kind of strategic aspects with technical aspects. And we'll be talking about cloud, European cloud industry, and how public authorities can facilitate its further development if they have to do it at all, using different mechanisms. So we'll be talking not only about cloud technology itself, but about competition policy, industrial policy, state aid, public procurement, this kind of traditional mechanism of public intervention, meaningful intervention into this sector. And my first question is just an invitation to give us a diagnosis of the situation with European cloud market, and maybe between the line explain why this market is so pivotal for overall architecture of European digital future. Francesco, maybe we can start with you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Oles, for having me. Always a pleasure being your guests. I think we've been talking about this for a while, haven't we? So honestly, the situation hasn't changed in the sense that the why the cloud is so important and where we are has not changed. What is changed, I think, is the awareness of the reasons. And unfortunately, or fortunately, also because of the political situation. So things that I was preaching just 5 years ago, and everybody was telling me, forget about it. We will never have a problem with America. They are friends of us. They will never fight us. They will never switch the killer switch off, because this has never happened and will never happen. Now these things are changing. The perception, the awareness that these things can truly happen, and actually have already happened, is much broader in the market than before. What has not changed on the counter side is the conviction or awareness that the European industry is basically totally dependent on the cloud platforms. So you asked the question, why is cloud so important? Forget about the cloud. Let's talk about digital. Let's split it into physical infrastructures and logical infrastructures. But let's make a very rough split. So if you think about the physical infrastructure of the digital economy, the digital world, the digital solution, the digital backbone, whatever you want to mean it, is very largely made on what we call cloud. The logical infrastructure is made by the applications and by the upcoming artificial intelligence and agentics. So we could open a book about what is going to happen in a few years from now, but it's already happening. When it gets to the cloud, let's not forget that data, algorithms, and everything about digital does not run on rainbows or clouds in the physical terms. They run on some physical infrastructures. And for too long, Europe, and not just Europe, have neglected the importance of the physical infrastructure of such an economy. Every economy has got a physical infrastructure, a critical infrastructure, transportation, healthcare, energy, you name it. We forgot too long that digital as well has got a critical infrastructure, as well has got some physicalities, and we completely lost control of it. So that's why it is important. The why things have not changed is because, unfortunately, this is going to last for long. And there's no single economic sector that does not depend on digital nowadays. Everybody understands that. What people don't understand yet is that this is not a fight between Europe and America. Not at all. I've been the first saying that, it's useless to fight. If you want to find enemies, you will always find one. I try to look at the market and say, if you want to be good in the market, you have to be better than the ones dominating the market. And Europe has not understood yet how to do it. I've been preaching for too long that we need to completely change the business model and move into a collaborative model. But unfortunately, this is unnatural. It's not natural. So companies still want to mind their own individual business. And this will make us die. And I will pause here for a sec.
As we can see, we'll have very engaged discussion. So already many questions emerge from this introductory remark by Francesca, and I'm sure more will emerge from Nitika's and Dionysios' points as well. Nitika.
So, and yeah, thank you, Les, for having me here. I think the why, as Francesco said, is that it is, the cloud infrastructure. I mean, you're talking about, the infrastructure layer is a backbone for the tech industry. But, and I think that has just become all the more important with the emergence of AI, and for any, even non-digital sectors to take advantage of, some of the productivity advances from AI, they need to be able to have access to the cloud. So, cloud becomes important for AI in various ways. You needed to train the models, you needed to access the models, and you need access to the cloud for also being able to develop your own AI applications. And this feeds into, all the sectors of the industry, not just digital. So I think it's become a more strategic industry than I think was considered before, the ChatGPT moment. And another thing that, stands out to me is that one of the biggest productivity gaps identified by the Draghi report in Europe is in the tech sector as well. And again, this goes back to, what is the underlying infrastructure, and cloud again comes into the picture there. And so I think there is a fair bit of awareness now and analysis, actually robust analysis showing, how important cloud is to the different parts of the industry.
Thank you very much, Nitika. Dio?
Well, I don't really have too much to add per se. I fully agree that between geopolitics on the one hand and technological innovation on the other, the importance of digital infrastructure, especially in the form of the physical infrastructure necessary to carry out a lot of those activities, has increased a lot in the last few years, right? That is definitely part of what we're talking about. That 5 years ago, as Francesco said, that wasn't really a concern, and it's become more and more a concern due to both geopolitics and technological reasons. I think a key element here is what Francesco mentioned, that the necessity for collaboration, right, between issues of scale on the one hand and the diversity, if you wish, of the single markets in many, many different ways. Collaboration is essential. So I think this is a key element when talking about sort of the importance of cloud and how can Europe sort of catch up to an extent or have its moments. State intervention comes in as a very important facet, be it in sort of instituting that collaborative framework or allowing it to exist, or facilitating it through, for instance, joint procurement or the planned rule book and procurement guidance for cloud, the Cloud and AI Development Act. There are plenty of things from the center, let's say, in Brussels, emanating out, trying to create sort of a federated, collaborative structure. I think a key limitation, and I'm going to close with that, is a lot of that movement towards collaboration and towards new frameworks is cloaked in the language of strategic autonomy or open strategic autonomy. And while this is a very important concept and definitely part of the policies that underwrite this entire move, I think there needs to be a lot of, Europe needs to be quite careful not to equate autonomy with autarky and cut itself out or basically put itself in a position where it is trying to replicate things simply for the sake of them being European. And I think it's a difficult, perhaps a difficult balance to walk for, especially the more bureaucratic elements of the European structure. That autonomy, open strategic autonomy doesn't mean protectionism or total decoupling. It's about finding a balance.
Okay, let us move deeper into this, because I think that's something which is very important. We have two archetypical regulatory models. Stereotypes, as all stereotypes, is myopic and it's only cliche. But we have kind of free market approach, which wasn't, of course, we all understand that Silicon Valley was built with significant industrial policy in mind, of course. and more kind of authoritarian model. And there are many different shades in between. So we learned that Europe must, or that's the only probably plausible scenario, to have it in the form of federated model, where it's not about building up on steroids one big company. It's impossible, and then it will be, or is it possible? Let me ask you as a question. Please elaborate, Francesco. You've been pioneering, championing this idea of federated collaboration, and not only in kind of in the textbooks or in the kind of academic forums, but in practice. You made your hands, into it. You've been doing this thing. So let us revert now to the issue how having two extremes, caricaturized extremes as the two sides of the plus and minus, which out of 50 shades should Europe choose?
Yeah, you said it well. I've been pioneering, and I had my, I've been stabbed all over my body, sometimes backstabbed by people to work or to wish for the common good of Europe, but in reality they were just minding their own lobbies. And unfortunately, the lobbies of European companies equals, I have to say, in tech company, or not just in tech companies, most of the time equals to the lobbies of the American companies. And again, I said before, and I repeat myself, I've never been against it. I've been also told that I preached against the Americans. I dare anyone to find a single word against Americans. I've always said the opposite. If you want to be good in a market, you have to do a simple thing. You have to do something that the market needs, that is not out there yet, and you have to be the first doing it. And when I was in Gaia-X, I said it very clearly. I said, to me, what the market needs today is a new model of federated digital services. What that means, very simply, we have changed the world. In the last 2 decades, data used to be centralized. They could be centralized. Nowadays, with the Internet of Everything, data cannot be centralized. So on the one side, we preach that data is everywhere. Yes, but how can you exploit the world of distributed data if you don't have distributed computing, distributed model, distributed learning, distributed clouds in the end, these distributed services. So that's very much missing. And it's a tremendous opportunity because the ones that became big, building super centralized, hyper centralized, and hyperscalable architectures are the ones that do not want to destroy those business models because they have invested a lot of money. So it's a kind of a greenfield. On the other side, and this is more of a technical perspective. So if you want to build a new generation of digital services, they must be distributed, decentralized, and interoperable. And interoperable means commercially and technically. On the other side, there's an economic problem. So when you are weak in an economy, it doesn't have to be cloud or digital. Think about agriculture. I keep making that example because everybody understands that. So if you are a small producer of fruit, apples, grapes, whatever you want, and cannot fulfill the market demand, not because your product is not good enough, but you don't have the richness of portfolio to fulfill the demand, or you cannot reach the territory, or whatever, you're just small. What do you do? And that's a very simple model. You need an inorganic growth model because you cannot grow organically to produce all the market needs. You can only grow inorganically, but inorganic growth can happen in 2 ways. One is by acquisitions. So if you are a farmer, you can buy many other farmhouses. But it does not work in agriculture and as well in digital because you have to find the right places. You have to find people that want to be acquired. It's quite a long and painful path. Or you can grow inorganically through a collaborative, cooperative model. Cooperatives is what saved, for example, the world of agriculture in the past century, because that allows small producers to maintain the quality, to maintain the localization, still be able to win and play and win in a market that is bigger, sometimes even global. I think the time has come for digital services to become something like that. So we need to stimulate and inject a culture of ecosystem in a world where no company wants to collaborate with others. And let me answer your question, because that's very important. What should Europe do? I've been fighting my fight, and honestly, I failed, not because I was wrong, because even Mario Draghi after years said the same things I'm saying now, but because there is no intention of Europe to invest in creating an ecosystem. An ecosystem is a coalition of individuals. And unfortunately, I know all the players in Europe. I know all the cloud service providers. I know the smaller and the bigger ones. And I know also the policymakers. On the policymaking side, this has never been enforced. Yes, everybody talks about federation, but in reality, can you tell me a single incentive to make a federation happen? And a federation must be commercial. On the other side, even the companies, the biggest companies say, yes, we need to federate, we need to work together. Can you tell me two companies that decided to have just a common standard of interoperability, if not an agreement to resell each other? No. That's what I've tried to do with Dynamo. So I smashed my face against the wall, and because I wanted to show Europe that the problem is Europe. That does not happen anywhere else in the world, because there is not a combination of policymakers forcing a necessary action in the market. And therefore, for the enterprises, it's not natural to collaborate with their competitors. But the problem is that they believe they can still compete, but they are dying. They have lost 3/4 of the market share, and in the next 5 years, they will lose it even the last quarter. So unfortunately, I can preach, and that's not me convincing anyone. Look at the numbers. Look at Eurostat data. Look at the market numbers. They are dying, but no one wants to collaborate with others. Seriously, the collaboration must be enforced. It's not sufficient to invest in innovation. It's important. But if you have no market, innovation will be lost. In the best case, will be lost by someone else. It's not sufficient to preach for federation. You need to enforce it and incentivize it. And it's not even sufficient to preach for buy European if you don't sell European. And the risk is that in a short while we won't have something to sell under the European tech. So I think that we have come to the point where we truly understand. I mean, I truly understand what the problem is. We preach European, everybody preaches European, but nobody wants to collaborate in an ecosystem environment. This must be a combination of private and public action. And I tell you one last thing. I'm an entrepreneur, so I know the mindset of investors. You know, somebody in Europe keep preaching, we're not investing enough money. We don't have enough money. Wrong. It's totally wrong. The money's there, but if you are an investor, you want to invest where you know that that money will produce something in line with your strategy or in line with the strategy of the company you invested in. This is why in Europe, public investments don't match private investments because they're not convergent into market actions. If this miracle happens, I tell you that public investments will find equal, if not more investments from the private sector. To do what? To develop products that can be more competitive in the market. And since this is not possible for a single company, everybody would want the money just for them. It must be done in a collaborative, cooperative model. And that's, I think, the key of the problem. We're not creating a digital ecosystem, industrial ecosystem in Europe.
And before giving the floor to Nitika and Dionysios, I just a tiny remark. This diagnosis resonated with my intuition, but once I attended the summit of European cloud providers, organized and masterfully coordinated by you and your company, Francesco. I was really, and I have seen this kind of enthusiasm among competitors essentially, and everything has been done to put this initiative, you know, into kind of to show the best scenario of federated cohort. So even if this approach resonates with your kind of current conclusion that it's not as easy as one would think, I would probably concur with your conclusion as well.
I will give you, I'm sorry to my colleagues, but just one simple example that anybody can understand. You know what we're missing in Europe? The roaming of digital services. When roaming was imposed to the telcos, they were not happy. You know why? Because they have to rely on partnership, commercial and technical partnership with other companies. So in other words, is a revenue split. But it works. If we didn't have roaming, we would be back to the Middle Age. But that has to be imposed. That has to be imposed. After you impose something like that, you know what? The business will find their own way and they will build even more business. We are waiting for the advent of a roaming of the cloud and digital services. Policymakers do not have the gut to make it happen. And enterprise, they preach for it, but they don't want it because they don't care. They care about the quarterly profit and loss. I've been a CEO, and unfortunately, this is it was my job, profit and loss. So we are between a rock and a hard place. But the truth is very simple. Everybody preaches European, and they all mind their own individual company business. Doesn't work.
Thank you.
Sorry to be blunt.
Thank you very much. Nitika.
Yeah, I think one other shade of gray, that has some precedence, and sort of taking it, I completely agree with what Francesco said, and the entry has this supply from Europe has to come either by identifying certain gaps in the market for which there is almost guaranteed demand, and so the companies can get some return, and maybe that comes from public procurement or other policies. We'll see. But another shade of gray that has some precedence is the Airbus model. And there's a question about whether we should encourage an Airbus in the cloud sector. Now, in the first place, I don't think that's even possible because unlike, Airbus, where you build a plane and you sell the same plane for a few decades, cloud is a very fast evolving sector. We've seen that the technologies have changed, within a span of a few years, and it's still evolving. And so, there's requirement for continuous capital investment in it. So I don't think that model can be adapted to tech. But even if it was, the question is, do we want that? Do we want to take that approach? Because, and I think the answer is no, because ultimately what's going to matter for Europe is the ability to innovate and adapt in the long run. And so rather than choosing one winner, we want to make it as competitive, for firms to get the public funds rather than just choose one single firm. And hence, I think any kind of public procurement, public funds should be organized around some key principles, where it's based on the sector rather than, individual firms, and multiple firms allowed to compete for it. So that's to say that, and competition, we have evidence that competition stimulates productivity. And ultimately, that's what we want Europe to grow and to be, to innovate going forward. So I think that's saying that model is probably not one of the shades of gray that we want to choose for cloud.
Thank you very much, Nitika. Dionysios.
Well, first of all, I fully agree with Nitika that the Airbusization, let's say, of the cloud is not necessarily something that makes sense. It is a very neat idea in European circles because it's also quite conceptually simple. Like, let's all pull together and build one big thing that is going to compete with everyone. But there's no guarantees of success. It works better in some industries than others. It worked with Airbus. It doesn't mean it's going to work with the cloud or with anything else. Going back to the shades of gray question of where exactly would the European model land, I think it's a very difficult question because going back to what Francesco said as well, there is a lack of political will to sort of break eggs and make an omelet. There is a bit of timidity when it comes to things like this. I mean, and I think this is a big differentiator from, let's say, the Chinese model, which basically can operate on a different time scale and is not dependent on elections and all of that. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing for Europe. I'm saying it sort of takes out a lot of the impetus that comes with Chinese industrial policy. And it is, honestly, I think it's a question of trying to square the circle. It is very difficult to get everyone to agree on what to do and on what is needed and on how to get there. For instance, like a very centralized model would be slow and consensus driven, so it would probably, after a few years, fall out of step and lose pace. One completely left to sort of play with laissez-faire rules, we don't know where that would end up. I'm not sure I fully agree with Francesco that the private money is there if and when it's necessary. I mean, he definitely knows better than I do. My part of what informs my thinking is that I think it's very difficult for Europe to replicate the American model as well. Despite the American model also having huge inlays of public funds, there's also an extremely rich private capital market, which Europe hasn't managed to get to yet. So the short answer is I'm really not sure how that can be imposed. I agree that it needs to be imposed. I think that between narrow corporate self-interest, narrow member state self-interest as well, because we must not forget that it's the European Union, it's not the United States. It's not a purely federal state under one common identity. It is still 27 member states wearing a trench coat, pretending to be a federation when it suits them, and devolving into regionalism whenever it suits them. So it's not just about making corporate interests align, it's also about making member state interests align. And that needs to be imposed. I don't know how it's going to be imposed. I think it's going to be very tricky. It's probably, in my view, going to have to be a mix of various different regulatory interventions that sort of limit the width of the playing field. Let's say it's like, okay, you can play here and nothing outside of this. Because as Francesco, I don't think there is the willingness for a purely top-down, this is what you're going to do. I think the eventual solution, and I think we can see that already by the sheer number of instruments coming out of Brussels as proposals, as guidelines, and eventually as hard law as well. It's not one big act, it's various different elements and bits all pushing towards something. Now, the coherence of what they're pushing toward is a whole other conversation that can have us here for a week. So I'm going to put a pin in it.
I'm fascinated by Francesco's, Francesco's experience. So, sorry for taking your position as asking the question, but like, do you think like public procurement could provide some of the impetus that, it is at least proposed to provide? I'd be keen to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, yes, but again, there is nuances. I have to say, digital is a complex world in itself, because digital technology is complex and the nuances of technology are becoming even more and more complex. But people tend to approach it in the most simple way, like black and white, good and bad, and one silver bullet. Now, the latest silver bullet that I hear talking about is buy European in public procurement. I'm one of the authors of the Eurostec, so I'm one of the. I'm guilty because I've suggested that, but I know by heart what I mean by that, and I think that we have to dig into it a little bit. So let me give an example. First of all, public procurement is obviously not making the old market. We all know that. But it's the only way where you can act quickly enough to trigger a change.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because everything you buy with public money has to be justified. And we have procurement rules to do that. So can we act on procurement rules to make them more fair, not restrictive to non-European providers, not discriminating, but not the other way around, not discriminating European providers? Yes, we can, and we must do it, because nowadays the situation is the opposite. And I tell you why. In all the public procurement, in all the public tenders I've worked on in my life, I have not seen a single case where an hyperscaling technology was necessary. Sorry to say that. In the public sector, we are not, running space shuttles. It's pretty easy stuff. And all the public tenders I have seen, they are services to run very basic digital stuff. Sometimes it is 10, 20 years old. So you don't need that type of facility. Point one. Point two, pricing wise, most of the techniques that were adopted by the hyperscalers were to hide dumping, which is illegal, behind packaging. So I package services and resources, and overall I win on the price. Yes, but if you split down, you will find that on the resources prices, in fact, they applied dumping and they won against many European bidders. Third, fit for purpose. I was glad to read the other day that this is coming, and I had many discussions with DigiCom, with DigiConnect, to suggest ways to, let me say, modify public procurement rules in order to incentivize the buy European, but in the way that I'm trying to describe here. So I'm glad to see that now. I read a couple of days ago that something is coming out in that sense. And the sentence was to ensure that solutions procured are fit for purpose. Now, another lesson learned from my side is when you bid for a public tender, most of the times there is no sufficient evidence of the fit for purpose of the tender requirements. In other words, if the technical requirements are not detailed enough, or if they are detailed and there is no justification of why you cannot choose another European providers to do the same, what wins is the brand. So nobody will ever blame me if I choose AWS or Microsoft or Oracle or whatever, because they are the best in the world. If I choose Ionos, Aruba, Gigas or whatever, and something goes wrong, so it'll be my fault. So brand wins. So to me, if we adjust, which is normal stuff in the private sector, if we make sure that the requirements, technical requirements and commercial requirements in the public tenders are detailed enough to justify the selections based on the fulfillment of the requirements, that would be a great discriminator, because there will be a lot of tenders that truly cannot be assigned to non-European providers. But before, you need to ensure that we need to have a minimum number of bidders from Europe, which is not less than the number of non-European bidders. And this is another big problem. Nowadays, 80% of the bidders are non-European. So why not simply force a simple rule? For any public tender, you must have a minimum number of European bidders equal to the non-European ones. And second, you need to provide verifiable rules for technical requirements and for commercial requirements. And then, okay, if we find out that European providers cannot win that tender, we will have identified weaknesses that must be addressed by the market. Nowadays, we are not in that situation. So the European lose, they don't know why, and the public procurement rules are loose and not detailed enough to avoid that happen. So we can stay in the boundary of the law without changing it too much, simply asking for more details on the commercial and technical assignments, technical evaluation points, if you want.
Thank you very much, Francesco. Let me, before reverting this question to you, Nitika, yourself, and to Dionysios, maybe to comment, just wanted to know that I recently interviewed Gordon Christian from Siemens, and he was very open, saying that European markets are public procurement markets are most welcoming to foreign companies. In any other jurisdiction, you will not have such equal rules, and they are much more protectionist, most of other jurisdictions. So we are not talking about being more pro-protectionist, we are talking about being more or less even with other jurisdictions. And speaking also about different tools, I think somebody from Ecosia mentioned to the Commission itself, just buy us, start using us. That's, or for Ecosia, you don't need to buy them, use us. That's the motto which he wanted to channel to the Commission. But that's okay. I'm just asking. So Nitika, how would you answer your question?
So I think, you know, I haven't been on the ground like Francesco has been, but there are sort of two themes that, you know, resonate with my experience that he mentioned. One is, so I think, you know, building hyperscale infrastructure is a big undertaking. You know, it is, you know, has very high costs, and, you know, there are certain levels of scale you need to reach. But I think there is reason to think that, if the public procurement system was somehow, adjusted the way Francesco suggests, that there would be emergence of competition by specializing. So European firms don't have to build the whole stack, the cloud stack, but rather they could enter with more specialized offerings. Like we already see some of the specialized cloud providers like Coviv, they specialize in the AI computing space, for example. And so similarly, we could see something for sovereign or, public procurement solutions. And maybe that's the way to enter rather than, start big, but actually start by entering solutions which have immediate demand, like the public procurement. And I think the other thing, just very practically, again, from my experience as well, is, having, and I think Francesco touched on this in a very nice way, is having a multidisciplinary team, so for someone technically in the public procurement teams, actually understanding what the required solution is and designing the tenders accordingly. So I think that there is an increasing integration between, the different disciplines, for example, at DG Comp, and I think increasingly there should be a similar integration, multidisciplinary approach across, the different departments, so to say, including the procurement agencies.
Thank you very much, Dionysios. I wanted to invite you to comment on this, but also maybe to start answering on another question. And that question, I think a new phrase, maybe at least new for me, has been called roaming for clouds, which resonates very well with my understanding. Now I understand better that it should be forced. Don't rely on the instincts of the companies, because that's the wrong way probably. So the question is, we have several areas of law, competition law, very interconnected, public procurement, state aid as an autonomous part of competition law. We have industrial policy as a kind of broader, overarching kind of umbrella policy. Reflecting on what has been asked by Nitika, and also then reverting to the next question, what would be how do you envisage, because you examine the technicalities of state aid policy, what's your, first of all, again, diagnosis of the situation? Are we ready to modify state aid rules? In what direction they should be modified, etc., please?
All right, first off, I am not going to address procurement too much in the beginning. I'm going to address it a bit more as I go into how to proceed. But very, very quickly on procurement, yes, there are issues with contracting authorities and expertise within contracting authorities very often, mentioned by both Nitika and Francesco. But when we talk about public procurement, I think it is important to have an all of EU perspective and understand how wide the concept of a contracting authority is, in the sense that I'm in favor, personally, of more flexibility within the procurement framework, especially when it comes to SMEs, especially when it comes to innovation procurement or pre-commercial procurement, a bit like the green procurement approach that has been touted, especially in economic literature, for quite a few years now. But then that sort of clashes with the reality of Europe is 27 different member states, and while Luxembourg and the Netherlands might run a squeaky clean ship, other places don't necessarily do that, making very prescriptive procurement rules perhaps necessary, both for the rationale of the internal market, i.e. no discrimination in favor of national companies, and on a more controlling the public purse point of view. So this is more of a, I fully agree that procurement needs to be reformed and needs to be made fit for purpose, and strategic procurement should be allowed more, but we should also have the reasoning of procurement in the back of our heads somewhere, that it's also not just about this, it's also about making sure that Germany doesn't just buy German and Greece doesn't just buy Greek and so on, because that's a subset of buy European. If you're fine with buy European, why are you not fine with buy German or buy French or buy Italian? And then there's also the controlling the public purse and minimizing corruption. On the question of how this can be imposed, as we said, there's a lot of different areas of law interacting, and with a lot of different bases. You have, as we said, competition law, a state aid as part of it, public procurement as sort of a lex specialis within the single market non-discrimination framework. Also, I would say probably issues coming from data protection and fundamental rights sort of seep into the discussion of what is to happen, how it is to happen. Right, I think a big part of the European way and the trying to find which shade of gray suits us also has to do with values, or with intangibles that go beyond the purely practical or economical. Now, in how you can sort of mandate it, I do not really have a black and white easy answer. There's already an important project of common European interest, which is a specific exemption or compatibility route for state aid. So there is one, it's an important project of common European interest, IPCEI. When I say IPCEI, that's what I mean, because it's a mouthful to say it out every single time. There is one on cloud that's been going on for a couple of years now. Slightly over $1 billion has been invested. That is sort of a way to push towards collaboration, because effectively the way IPCIs work, they require a minimum of 4 member states to be participating, and as a condition for the Commission approving it, those participating member states have to open it up to every other member state. So every member state, or rather undertakings from every member state with the support of the respective member state, can actually participate in the IPCI. And this is a very neat idea and one that has received a lot of attention. If you listen even beyond the cloud and into industrial policy a bit more broadly, when you hear the president of the Commission and the commissioners themselves talking about industrial renewal, IPCIs pop up quite a lot. They pop up in the Draghi report, they pop up in the Letta report, they pop up in Commissioner Séjourné's portfolio and in Commissioner Ribera's portfolio. They are an important aspect, let's say, but they fall in my view, and in the view of the European Court of Auditors when it looked at the hydrogen IPCI, is that they fall into the Airbus problem, what I mentioned earlier. Too much coordination necessary, too slow, and nothing really seems to work out. Or rather, it doesn't work out at the necessary pace. So the IPCIs are a good idea, but the way then that it is governed takes away a lot of the wind from the sails. And this is what I think state aid rules can definitely be reformed. We have seen this from 2020 onwards, especially with COVID first, where the Commission basically said, I'm going to look that way, do whatever you must. And then eventually in a much more structured way with Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the temporary crisis framework, which became a temporary crisis and transition framework, which eventually became the Clean Industrial Deal state aid framework. There is an instrumentalization, let's say, of state aid towards specific purposes. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you view it, this has worked out much more in terms of clean tech than digital tech. And that, of course, also reflects perhaps the political situation in member states and the priorities of member states, because it is their money after all. But there is definitely space and impetus for reform. I think the reform of the procurement directives, combined with the EU's Innovation Act, or proposal for an Innovation Act, and the Startup and Scale-Up Strategy, which is also at the proposal stage, I think this gives us a much more promising area of very strong nudging, because you can, by reforming both sets of rules at the same time, or at least relaxing certain things having to do with state aid, as happened, for instance, with clean tech under the Clean Industrial Deal framework, which goes beyond the content of the relevant research, development, and innovation framework for state aid. If you sort of try and synergize the two reforms, allowing for more possibilities and flexibility within innovation procurement and its various modalities, taking the logic of green procurement and applying it into more tech-oriented strategic deployment of procurement, looking at things way beyond the price element. Because as Francesco effectively said, the fixation on the price element has the effect of benefiting the hyperscalers benefiting the already established players. If we want to use, procurement is a huge pot of money. If we want to use it strategically, we should use the reform of the directives as a tool to push towards that. And I mean, that goes with a suite of other reforms, with facilitating administration and cross-border bids and collaboration in public procurement, which, while flexible, is still subject to quite a few rules and regulations, training contracting authorities to be more open to novel types of procurement, and effectively recognizing that the public purpose of public procurement can very often be to buy office management website for a ministry or buy pens and paper, but there is also a much more strategic angle to it that is indisputable. And I think this is something that the European Union has missed out through public procurement law and its utilization, compared, for instance, with the United States, where procurement and moonshots tend to be a bit more easily or readily available.
Thank you very much, Dionysios. Francesco, how do you think this can be done by public authorities? Which elements are missing? Which elements are misunderstood? What should be done to achieve this meta goal of roaming in cloud?
Well, the recipe, as far as possible, we sketched it out in in many papers, but in the Eurostat in particular, we try to give a recipe, which is a combination of interventions. So the public procurement is one of them, but as Dionysios said correctly, it could help. I'm sure it can help. Let me say, it could be a trigger to change things in the market, but definitely is not a solution. Another important thing, and I try to recap the key areas very quickly, but another important area of intervention is the first thing we have to do. Europe misses an industrial strategy for digital. I know it's a big statement, but it is what it is. So Europe has never made industrial plans for any industry, but now we have a chance, because digital is the industry of the industries, if you want. But if we don't set clear objectives we want to achieve in the market, and business drivers, key performance indicators, and we monitor basically what we want to achieve, we will never achieve anything. Nowadays, the plethora of programs, including the IPS size, unfortunately, they are not converging into any single plan. So first, we need to have a digital industry strategy or plan with clear objectives, milestones, KPIs, and investments must be allocated proportionally to the achievement of those objectives. And we need to be aware that the objective is in the market. So we are not talking about, fluffy stuff. We are talking about a loss of market control, a loss of market share, a loss of share of wallet, a loss of control on something that in turns will control any economic sector. And this is another important point. IPS size are very important. Nonetheless, they suffer of the same disease of all the other European investments. They must be all pre-competitive. So one of the biggest problems of the European action, regardless of the money they put in it, it must be pre-competitive. Now, answer a very simple question. If the problem of Europe is competitiveness and the money we put goes in pre-competitive projects, will we ever solve the problem? No. So there is a hope behind every single project coming from the Digital Europe program, the IPSI, CIS 1, 2, and the third. There is a hope that some of that money invest will produce some deliverables that will be used eventually by some of the industry. But that's not sufficient at all. You need to start from the commitment that what you will develop you enterprise that get the money, you will adopt it in the market, and you will show revenues coming out of that deliverables. I have been in the business, and I tell you, most of the European companies that participate to the public tenders, you know what? They have a division for funded projects. That means one part of the company develops its own product, services, and business. Another portion of the company is dedicated to get public money to run those projects. Do you believe they talk to each other? No, most of the cases they don't. One side lives on public funding to deliver deliverables that will never be measured against the revenues they produce in the market, or against, they are not asked to be sold in the market, let me say. But the expectation is this. So we have policy-making action, making big claims and big statement. We are going to build the cloud infrastructure of the future. The end result is we build an IPSAI CIS that turns out to be, okay, we will use some technologies to make some cloud providers interoperable, but there is no commitment by a consortium, a partnership of cloud operators to adopt that technology in their platforms and sell that technology in the market. The result is that nothing will happen. So the pre-competitive nature of our investment is another problem we need to solve. You mentioned that in other countries, in the United States, you will not bid because the public money goes to American companies most of the times. Okay, I'm not saying that this is right, but not either the opposite. So we need to review the law of public, of state aids and public investments, preserving the open market, preserving also the trust, the antitrust and competition law, but not where the market is totally hijacked by others and where basically 60% of our public money goes over the ocean because we keep using their technologies. A third element, which I think is important, is about regulation. I was in Berlin talking to a very interesting pool of people the other week, and Siemens was there. And when I was saying that, you know, why in Europe we didn't have someone like Amazon who was building, you know, wholesales and decided to become a big leader in cloud, why we didn't have something like that in Europe? For example, Siemens or Bosch or BMW could do that, you know? And Siemens said, yes, we know, and we are doing, and we are developing it, but we are strangled by regulation. So on the one side, they are investing in innovation. On the other side, they are strangled and really struggling with the compliance to the European regulation. Now, this is a big thing. We need to review regulation because the regulatory framework of digital in Europe is very much overlapped. So there are rules clashing one another. And a big portion of it, I would not say a number, but believe me, more than 50% of the rules cannot be verified and therefore are not enforceable. So we see a problem of policy enforcement, but we don't ask ourselves why we cannot enforce the policy. Simple, because it's not verifiable. So you can write whatever rule you want, but if you cannot verify it, it will be just an overhead. And this is another thing we need to act on. So public money, let me say, the law of competition, antitrust, and the public ads must be reviewed, not to penalize, let me say, European providers, and to produce something tangible in the market, because the problem is in the market. Second, we need to review the public procurement rules, not because it will save the world, but because it will trigger a change, at least in perception, that will be inherited by the private sector, I'm sure. And third, we need to review the regulation framework, not to throw it away, but to restrict it to the part that can be enforced. On top of all, we need an overall European plan, industrial plan for digital, to set clear objectives and milestones, and not like now, a plethora of programs that are not converging into any single thing, and all of them are producing pre-competitive deliverables.
Thank you very much, Francesco. Nitika, how do you see this?
Yes, I think building on what Francesco said, there are a couple of principles, that I think would be, we should embed. One is embedding, competition principles within the industrial policy that Francesco is talking about. And that means that firms, and just, that firms are not investing their efforts into winning some handouts from the government, but actually investing in their products and services to be able to, innovate and actually be able to compete with, non-European firms. And just taking the example of subsidies, for example, and the competition authorities can actually help the public, the regulatory authorities structure the subsidies in such a way that it actually enables competition between even European firms, but also we do want some competition from non-European firms, right? Like so that there is no sort of complacency, and actually European firms can be at the forefront at a global scale. And I think the second principle is that competition policy also has to be forward-looking and agile. And I think the European Commission's review of the merger guidelines is one such example, adapting it to, for example, some of the federations, the collaborations, the need for scale, and recognizing some of the trade-offs that come within the current regulatory framework. And I think finally, my final thought is that some of the rules, that it is about writing the laws, but it's also about monitoring them. And that's where some of the, the efforts also need to be made to make sure, the investments are made in companies, that they're spent in the right way, and there's rigorous monitoring of the various policy tools.
Thank you very much. I know innovation is the king. I want to try an innovation in our discussion. I'll ask you 3 remaining questions together, and inviting you to choose answering quickly all 3 or any of the 3. So, Dionysios, the first one is I know Europe is sui generis and it's hard to find a meaningful comparator. And yet maybe we see some other jurisdictions, some regulatory techniques which we can transpose somehow, or the first question. The second one is your current big project or some changes which you want to update us on. And the third one is recommendation to students.
Okay, I'll take them in order then. In terms of regulatory techniques that can be tried, I think it is very much Europe's way. Let's say I think it's going to be very much mix and match. As we said in the beginning, the American model doesn't work, the Chinese model doesn't work, and the South Korean or the Japanese models, I think, are too case specific and society specific to be extrapolatable into all of the EU. So I think we can pick things from different jurisdictions. So we can pick and I think the EU is already moving towards that way, at least on the parts that have to do with subsidy control, sort of a 5-year plan, 5-year horizon. Let's run with it for 5 years and reevaluate in 5 years and course correct. There seems to also be, especially in the attempts to mobilize private capital much more, there seems to be an attempt to take some things from the American approach. And then you have the sort of embeddedness of industrial policy and the coordinating role of the public sector in South Korea and Japan, which I think also we are seeing. So I think it's a cocktail of regulatory techniques and approaches that Europe needs, again, because it is quite specific. It is very sui generis as an economy, as a political entity. Getting the buy-in for a Chinese-style industrial policy wouldn't work. For an American-style one, it wouldn't work. So I think it's a combination of various different things in which I think public interventions properly structured, so procurement, subsidy control, the enforcement of competition law, and the analysis more broadly of the objectives of competition law. Like, are we looking just intra-EU, or are we taking sort of a more global context into mind? Are we instrumentalizing one under the other, and so on? And also regulatory simplification, which is underway, is necessary. That's a key part. So I think balancing those 3 pillars is, to a large part, the key. Right? Consistency and long-term planning, mobilizing more both public and private funds, and simplifying the entirety of the landscape and trying to create obvious and clear synergies between all the regulations. Francesco was talking about undertake, or companies agreeing to help each other, well, that's until they breach Article 101, Paragraph 1, TFEU, and are in trouble with the NCAs or the Commission. So it's about enforcement, sort of tracking with the active policy, I would say. In terms of current projects, I am actually working on an edited volume with Dr. Lena Hornkohl from the University of Vienna on effectively how state aid is becoming part of EU industrial policy and how it is being instrumentalized by industrial policy to achieve industrial policy goals, as vague and wide as those are, ranging rather from decarbonization to a digital plan, which I agree should exist but doesn't. Oddly enough, we have a very detailed plan for the automotive sector. We do not seem to have one for cloud infrastructure and digital infrastructure more broadly. Finally, on recommendations for students, I would say the biggest recommendation I've always given to students is try and read widely, try and read from other disciplines, from other perspectives. Like if you are a law student, read insights from economics, from business organization studies, and so on. Don't limit yourself to, well, this provision is to be interpreted that way. Try to think in a more contextual and big picture way, and read as widely as your time allows you.
Thank you, Dionysios. Francesco?
Okay, in order as well. There is a lot we can always learn from others, but first we need to learn from others. And I think we spend enough money to understand the regulations and the approaches of different countries. It's easier to finger point and say, okay, these are bad and those are bad. So let me finger point to some of those bad chaps. It's the China and the US, and highlight some of the good things they've done. So China, they are control freak. So they said, we keep talking about regulation in Europe. What they did was to build a Chinese great firewall to control anything in and out through, data centers and servers controlled by the government. So like it or not, it works perfectly. Like in any enterprise, implementing a firewall. Anyway, and then they said, okay, given we cannot trust all the technologies we need to import, we need to start developing our new technologies. So for any platform that they ban or any way they control, they provide alternatives, to the point that even the Chinese population started to use some of the Chinese alternatives and started to use them and preferring them. So investing in developing alternatives is a necessary action if you want to keep control of the foreign technologies that you don't trust or trust partially, because regulation per se will not make the job. So you must have some way to physically control. Am I suggesting to build a European Great Firewall? No, but in a sense, maybe if we want to make use of the regulation, we should also enforce it technologically. Otherwise, it's useless. It's paper. Second example, United States. They wanted to be big in AI. They said, okay, let's look at the market. I mean, policymakers look at the market, invested in 3 big startups, sufficient cheap, and the one that won basically started ruling the game. They didn't sit around the table and started to debate around the possible future and legal implication of artificial intelligence. They bet on OpenAI. You know what? They won. So sitting around the table, the industry and the policymakers to define together business objectives they want to achieve and clearly defining them, it's something that in Europe we should start. America said, we want to go to Mars. And when they said it was 10 years ago, everybody was joking about it. And now they're making it. Where do we want to go in Europe? So to the second question, what I'm doing, I decided to step aside of Dynamo because I will let the partners I was working with to continue with it and decide to do what they want to do it, because they changed their mind about the importance of digital sovereignty. And given, you know me, Oles, I'm quite serious about what I believe and what I do. Okay, I said, okay, you don't believe in it anymore. I do believe it, and I will continue to work on it. And I'm working on making it continue, maybe with another approach. Instead of waiting others to come on board, I will start from something that onboards them, but I cannot disclose more. But I will continue on that route because I believe we need that different model of collaboration, federation, commercial and technical. And I will continue on that route. In parallel, I'm working on many researches. One topic that I'm working now, maybe will be out by the end of the year, is a research on skills. One very neglected topic. We are not slaves of technologies coming from over the ocean by accident. We have learned their language. We have learned their culture. And the reason that we now recognize the skills in digital, just counting the number of certifications of Microsoft, Google, and others, is because we don't have any alternative certification or skill mechanisms to recognize skills. This is a big problem because it must be solved starting from elementary schools up to universities if we want to create a new generation of digital experts that can regain control of digital. It's not sufficient to talk about public procurement. And here the answer to your third question to the students, please don't franchise your education. Try to look into what you study, try to distinguish between vendor-specific and vendor-agnostic skills, and try to go back to the basics in order to build the mindset and experience and skills and competencies that allow you to invent something new, or at the least to look at things from an agnostic perspective, because we are losing it. And this is very, very dangerous. So I'm working also on this skills and certification scheme for Europe paper.
Thank you very much. Nitika?
Thanks. One, I think you said it right, innovation is king, and with Agion and Howard just, having won the Nobel Prize yesterday, it's a good time to talk about, innovation and the relation with competition. So just picking up on that, I think, I completely agree with Dio that it has to be, a very forward-looking, agile, competition policy. And it has to be combined with other policies, very rightly with education and the skills in each country, as well as, the financial market regulations to make sure there's enough funding coming through. So it has to be a mix of policies, and we need to understand what policies can be used to address which issues. For example, competition policy can help us address some of the structural issues like concentration, but it doesn't help us, address issues about, say, financial market resiliency. So, being agnostic and being, sort of very targeted in where we use the different policy tools. Second, you asked about current work. So I'm working on various digital antitrust matters for different clients, and in a way that, we combine the economics with the with technologists and, understanding of the technology, and that's quite interesting. And finally, in terms of advice for students, I think it's an exciting time. There's a completely new digital revolution in the form of AI. And sometimes it can be disheartening to think that there may not be enough political will across, the different jurisdictions. But I think it is exactly you coming up, and getting the voice out there. And so, keep at it, be active, be vocal. That's my advice.
Indeed. Nitika Bagaria, Dionysios Pelekis, Francesco Bonfiglio, thank you very much for this really impressive conversation.